All right, welcome to our third session on the Paris Manuscripts. We are going to be looking at page starting at 85 to about 135 in the translation that we've been using um, by Martin Milligan. And so far, so good. Um, I don't know what we want to say about recapitulating where we left off, about the thesis of objectification, about the notion of which is developed in these pages we're going to look at tonight of human nature, but also the fact or the conundrum of the worker in distinction to civil society, and the argument that Marx makes throughout all of this is actually, I was reminded reading Leszek Kolakowski's Main Currents of Marxism, where he says something quite helpful, which is at this time, Marx was interested in a definition of man that went beyond the distinction between idealism and materialism and focused on what he called a naturalist humanism. A naturalist humanism. And so, what that has to do with is that as a sort of dialectic between the idea of the communist movement, of the socialist movement, and the way that that idea fuses with what Marx calls sensuousness, right? And I think that's a really good way to think about this naturalist humanism, because what Marx is actually talking about is the development of a sort of thinking about communism that can incorporate something beyond what he calls vulgar communism. And by vulgar communism, he really means basically most forms of communism, from Proudhon to Babeuf, which is these kind of like uh kind of ultra leftist tendencies, which we're going to get into in more detail later. But Marx has this idea that um, part of what needs to occur for socialist activity is this sort of refinement of a certain sensuality vis-a-vis a concept of society in order for socialists to think of a reinvention of need. So I think that's actually really central here, is the concept of need and the vulgar basis of need within capitalist conceptions. Right now, in capitalist society, we are reduced to what Marx will later in the Grundrisse refer to as the Robinsonade, right? We are these kind of like individualized, atomized units that only function on the basis of avarice. And I think that Tara had mentioned, Tara had mentioned before, how interesting it is that Marx is so concerned with avarice in this text, because a lot of Marxists that read Capital, they're always like, oh, Marx doesn't care about like the virtues of capitalism, or he's, no, but he's saying that there is a morality of political economy. And part of the development of a sensuous sphere of communist activity, um, I think, will involve some kind of destruction of that. And that is actually why Marx will critique atheism as reductive, because it is just lashing out at the idea of religion. It's not incorporating this Feuerbachian extra supplement of sensuality, of sensuousness. And so what I find interesting about that is that even though I think Kolakowski is right, that Marx is moving beyond the distinction between idealism and materialism here in some sense, I think that this structure will later become the basis of a new revamped theory of Marxist materialism. Whether we still retain the category of humanism and naturalism, I think we obviously do, but perhaps that's something for us to look at in the future. And I will say one thing before we jump into the text. I have invited a couple of more seasoned Marxist scholars who have expertise in alienation and Marx. So we may be surprised to have a lecture from one of these scholars. I won't name their names now, but it will be a surprise if they say yes. And we'll structure it like a Q&A. So like we just finish the text by next week, and then the week after that we will have a guest of some person. And if anyone has suggestions on that, who that person might be, please reach out to me with suggestions. But I thought that might be cool, so we could funnel all of our questions through somebody that's like really written on alienation in Marx and humanism in Marx as well. So those are just some like things to get our bearings straight. Any other opening thoughts for folks as they read this stuff before we go through in the way that we have been, page by page? It can be anything you want. I mean,
Um,
literally, please
Sorry, I
jump in.
should have raised my hand. Can you guys
Hey,
hear me? I have
yeah,
headphones, so okay, cool. Um, you got to like a lot of what I think are some of the really important points here. But I will say like I think it's even on the same page where he's talking about that crude communism. There's um there's a really interesting kind of critique of patriarchy and capitalism too, which is interesting. People don't I don't know. I feel like a lot of times when people want to do like Marxist gender theory or whatever you want to call it, they'll go to other Marxists, and it's interesting. It's not like that wasn't in his work. I mean, obviously, I don't think it was a central focus, but he does talk about it. So I just think that was, I don't know, worth mentioning and interesting here.
uh, thank you very much, Aaliyah. Thank you so much. Yes. When we get to that point, can you point out the page to us? Kaveh, please.
Yeah, hey everyone. Yeah, actually, these are really, I found it very dense this time
Yes.
around.
Yes.
And I was struck by the ideas about the whole man and the concept of totality. Maybe we can go
Yes.
into this and
Yes.
unpack. I think there's serious stuff's going on here.
This is
And
amazing. You know
yeah,
why? Because we said before that Marx does not have a refined or developed theory of fetishism or totality, which are two essential concepts in Capital. But you notice they're introduced now. They're
yeah,
introduced now. And then if we go back to the political biographical point, that Marx is very green in terms of his reading, and the fact that he introduces these concepts shows like some kind of profound situation of this man who's generating these concepts in a fit of inspiration, perhaps. But we will try our best to work through these, Cave. Please, Matthew.
Yeah, I was struck by in the discussion around alienation, the connections between alienation and what Hegel would call a rabble, people that are kind of unconnected to the life of the productive community in some way, people that are somehow subsisting and making life work outside of outside of capitalist production. Um, Talking about that as well as this kind of, and Hegel actually also writes about kind of what he calls like a rich rabble, that people who have so much wealth that they don't have to be involved in labor or production, also experiencing a kind of alienation. And that pops up in this text a few times as well. Like I think at the bottom of 80, I want to say 86 or 89. So I thought that kind of stuck out at me as well and might be a productive thing to talk about. The
Yes.
capitalist system is exploiting both the laborer as well as the property owner.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, production does not simply produce man as a commodity, the commodity man. It produces him in keeping with this role as a spiritually and physically dehumanized being. So that important point there is not that um, the lumpen or the rabble or those excluded from wage labor are dehumanized. It's the worker who is dehumanized. And then, of course, we saw from last time that the bourgeois is also alienated. So it's a double alienation that occurs. It's not a one-sided
Right.
I don't see the reference to the rabble. If you can find it for us, I would.
Oh no, I don't think it's explicitly referenced. I just see it. I see it as kind of an undercurrent in the discussion that's not explicitly referred to.
Really? Okay.
I
Okay.
think
Yeah.
you're referring to page 86 about the cheat, thief, swindler, beggar.
Ah.
Yeah.
Nice catch. Nice catch. Okay. So we're thinking that perhaps this is an homage to what would be the lumpen proletariat in some way, perhaps.
Right.
Thank you very much. Conrad, is it? Yes, Conrad, please.
Yeah, so just a couple of things. The first one is, I think, as Alia points out, the sort of periodization or discussion of the three different forms of communism that Marx engages in here is extremely interesting. Not just for the discussion on sort of avaricious or crude communism and the analogy there made with the, quote, community of women, but also for the next step he describes, which is a political communism, right? And if I remember properly, he says there that this would be, you know, a communism implemented politically, either despotic or democratic.
Yes, either despotic or democratic. That's right.
Yeah, in a society in which it's still affected politically by the form of private property. And I think, you know, that has to be taken as extremely suggestive by today's standards in light of the experience of the 20th century. So much so that I wonder if I'm reading it properly, because if you start to think about that, you know, I mean, we're so affected by, you know, this kind of Leninist vertigo that I think there's always a risk in that respect. Though seen through that prism, it is interesting that he rather casually says despotic or democratic.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes we have this tendency as Marxists to kind of, you know, fetishize forms of often even electoral democracy, whereas, you know, I think the real axis of communism is the relationship of the masses to the means of production, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, it would be like, well, who cares really, right? Like, you know, we have a totalitarian every day at work, right? Or if you do, right? What's the difference with respect to the overall system?
Well, that's actually the meaning of dictatorship. Dictatorship of proletariat, which would be developed later, was a reference of ancient Roman law simply to an emergency state of worker emergency rule. And so I feel that, like Richard Hunt's The Political Ideas of Marx and Engels asks that question, which is Marx and Engels' conception of democracy a totalitarian democracy or not? And he's very much influenced by like that Cold War American paranoia, but he tracks the difference, and it does change. Like sometimes it is openly for dictatorship, sometimes it's not. And then, of course, he says in 1844, all of these states were like quasi-feudal oligarchies. So they were dictatorships. So democracy could only be thought of vis-a-vis socialism at this point in 1844. But I think that obviously changes and mutates.
Well, I mean, there's a bit of an issue there. I mean, my understanding is that it's a dictatorship, and I was looking at, there's a scholar who writes about this effectively, but that it's non-pejorative in the context in which it's used. But the thing is that, you know, even if we're talking about the mid-19th century, a lot of what was going on in terms of the establishment of democracy was a lot more, necessarily so, a lot more sort of martial and assertive, more Republican, if you will. So, you know, today, in some respect, we take for granted, you know, this very sort of anodyne, you know, liberal dispensation. But that wasn't the context, you know, even if we were talking about democracy in its liberal sense, that wasn't the way that it was being put forth in that setting. But I wanted to add as well, when you talk about avarice, you know, it seems to me that the concern with avarice, I would take here to be, on some level, strongly Aristotelian. And we know that Marx, of course, was a kind of avid reader of Aristotle, and wrote his thesis on the Atomists, so was certainly familiar with ancient Greek philosophy. You know, I do think it's interesting with that. So of course, Aristotle differentiates between chromastitis, which is accumulation for accumulation's sake, and you know, sort of accumulation as a means to an end, as opposed to an end in of itself. And of course, economy comes from the Greeks, and it comes from the idea of household management. Originally, that was the idea. But yeah, in Aristotle, when Aristotle talks about economics, there's this whole a tremendous concern he evinces with the risk that a society will be overcome with you know, the production of wealth for no other reason than the production itself, and this will overwhelm other virtues, which is you know, supremely ironic in light of capitalism. But I think you'd have to say that there's a difference here, because it's like, what would you think about that, right? But I think that you have to say that there's a difference here, because it's interesting that you talk about kind of the moralistic character of this text, and it would speak to it as a transitional work that so
I didn't say it's a moralistic text. I just simply said that Marx identifies, say, Ricardo, Smith, Sismondi as having a veiled or unacknowledged moralism. Okay.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that Marx is proposing a better moralism or something like that. I don't think that I'm comfortable making that claim. Although maybe you would.
No, I'm just talking about what you're saying about avarice, and the frequent references to it. And I think it would speak to the status of this as a transitional text, because I think from a dialectical standpoint, I think you would say that if Aristotle is fairly, you know, concerned with these kind of terms in his presentation, this has to do with the fact that, as Marx will later point out in the first section of Capital, first chapter, I believe, Aristotle did not have an understanding of value, which is to say he was able to get far enough to understand that there must be a common substratum that unites things if they're capable of being exchanged, but that because he lived in a society that was defined by slave labor, and I think implicitly because he was a beneficiary of slave labor, like all the Greek intellectual figures were, that he was unable to kind of penetrate into the heart of the Greek economy, which puts him in the position of having to kind of approach it from a moral standpoint in that way. So I think this kind of speaks to the transitional status of the work, because on one hand, as Mazaros points out, Marx here is bringing out the concept of estranged labor and all of its implications, and seeing how pervasive that's going to be for the future of his thought. On the other hand, I think we have this recourse to a more moralistic set of terms, which I think does continue to evoke, in some sense, the Aristotelian legacy. So those would be my comments.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and that really tracks with by that point that I was struck by about the dialectic of the communist movement as having to encapsulate or to sort of give birth to a new sensuous object that would be distinct from the sort of like a kind of communal objectification of a concept of society that is realized in practical organizing and practical activity. I find that I don't find that necessarily as like a moral horizon, but it certainly is an alternative to the status of the human animal that the worker finds himself in, which we talked about last time at some length. So brilliant interventions, Conrad. I'm very honored to have your presence. May we go to Kent, please?
I just wanted to bring up that I think, like, in the last meeting, we didn't quite finish the section on alienation and alienated labor, and like we didn't quite get to the point where he is. I don't know what level of inference we're talking here, if it's like a deduction or what, like, is inferring that private property is the necessary consequence of alienated labor, of the external relation of worker to nature and to himself. That's on page 81. So I made a comment last time, like, when is he gonna explain exactly the presuppositions of the political economist? He does in this past couple sections, and I think if people have insights about private property in the modern tradition, that like take Marx to task both before and after him, I would love to hear those kind of comments. But yeah.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful, because the section that we are starting off with is the antithesis of capital and labor, and then landed property and capital. And he's talking about the way in which the capitalist system erodes forms of property ownership, and bottoms out into a commodification of property, and then that foments certain factional class wars that results in the inevitable triumph of the capitalist class, and that therefore the antithesis, or the reliance of this system of private property, faces off against labor in a particular way. And he really, I think, at the bottom of page 83 sets this up as a kind of master-slave dialectic in some sense. Everything which appears in the worker is an activity of alienation, of estrangement, appears in the non-worker also as a state of alienation and estrangement. And then he says, secondly, the worker's real practical attitude in production to the product appears for the non-worker as only a theoretical attitude. And so I also think that that's a kind of reference also to the distinction perhaps even between like mental and manual labor that is developed later in Marxist theory. And then he says, thirdly, the non-worker does everything against the worker, which the worker does against himself, but he does not do against himself what he does against the worker. So there's these antithetical nodes that are being developed between the status of the worker and the non-worker, and that, like we talked about last time, that philosophical conception of alterity, that notion of otherness as self-estrangement. And we did, I mean, I think we did go through the various forms of estrangement. We can either watch the video from last time to go through them again, or we could try to resurrect them now. I don't know what you all prefer. Because of time, I might prefer, since it's already 7:20, to proceed through, if that's okay, so that we can arrive at some of these. Is that possible? Or does anybody else want to jump in on this? On what we talked about last time, what was undone? I guess it would be up at page 83 through 85.
I think you wrapped it up well. I mean, there's the alienation from the product, alienation from oneself, alienation from other men, and alienation from species being. I don't know how much those four distinctions come up in the next section, but I think you're right. We should proceed.
Yes, they certainly don't exactly come up in the same way, because we're moving on to a slightly different terrain of consideration here, and we're moving on to a terrain of consideration that has an imminent historical completion to what Marx refers to as liberated capital, and the status of man in the context of liberated capital, and the particular and pernicious form of alienation that occurs at that stage in capitalist development, okay? Because before, he was really talking about the ossified and reactionary and sort of romantic situation that occurs between old different like landlords and how they fight with the capitalist class and so on. And now what we're talking about is the kind of tyranny of liberated capital over a fully commodified workforce in some ways. So it's moving to a slightly, perhaps you could say, more present terrain of reflection on capital. But let's hear from Tara, please.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to just follow up on the ethics question with just a sort of very basic insight for me, is that especially on page 120. I mean, we're basically being given a materialist description of ethics, right? And I thought it was fascinating when he says that, the ethics of capitalism is, to be sober, to really asceticism, thrift, right? And then that paragraph, though, that larger paragraph, if we ever have a chance to do a close reading, I just think it's very interesting. Oh, sorry. Like he says, the ethics of political economy is acquisition, but then the political economy of ethics is like the opulence of a good conscience, right? So so that conscience becomes, even having purchase on a sense of a type of sort of inherited or theological morality, is a type of privilege, or at least I thought, this is obviously some of the way that the dialectic works in language, but this in particular was really interesting to me. But in general, I just thought, just seeing that his point was really, these are not recommendations for the good life or for any, these are just the values or the modes of living that capitalism creates. So ethics less as the good life, and just that these are the ways of living to survive under capital, that become, almost in a Nietzschean sense, like with the genealogy of morals, like this is now good. And then when you were speaking about the sensuousness, there's just another amazing, I mean, I have to say, in reading this section, I was just like, wow, like I thought I had read this a long time ago. And I was like, what is this? But he has this great line where he says, private property makes us stupid. I mean, it's a translation, right? But I mean, it's just so, and that moves from, it condenses all of our sensuousness away from individual senses to just the sense of having, which again, I thought was really fascinating. And anyway, and then I guess I'm just capitalism go burr. But so yeah, I was really, but I guess in a larger question, and maybe this also speaks to some of the things Kent is talking about, but I think it's really the trajectory of the whole text, is like finally really starting to understand how labor is the essence of private property, right? That seems to be, right, that it's not landed property, it's actually labor. And this is a big switch for me, but it's one that I can't quite recreate, or I can't really lay out the thinking myself. And I'm not sure if anyone else struggles with that. So anyway, just a few ramblings, but I wanted to add to the ethics discussion, because I think I started it that first week. Thank you. You're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry about that. Well, yes, thank you. That was excellent. We will do our best to get at the relationship between private property and labor, because it's here in this section that we're considering right now from 85 to 92, but it also continues in the next section, private property and labor, where he really digs into physiocracy, Adam Smith, Ricardo, and so on. So yes, but Tariq, please. Actually, no, so you're not, Andrew, and then Conrad.
Yeah, what Tara brought up about the essence of private property is labor, but I guess my question would be, in regards to Marx's analysis of labor in this text, would it be the sort of theory of a labor value that
why don't we do this? Do you have the text in front of you, Andrew?
Yeah.
Why don't you read 87? Read the paragraph starting with the relations of private property contain. I was
Yeah,
just going to recommend, if you don't mind reading 87, the relations of private property contain. Let's just read that paragraph.
yeah, right
I
here.
think
So
this is
it's
a good
like,
exercise for us, just to sort of read through it. So we're not just sort of commenting willy-nilly.
yeah.
You
So
mind?
right here, he says the relations of private property contain
Yeah.
latent within them the relations of private property as labor, the same relations as capital, and the mutual relations of these two to one another. Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So he then adds on, there is the production of human activity as labor, that is, as an activity quite alien to itself, to man and to nature, and therefore to consciousness and the flow of life, the abstract existence of man as a mere workman, who may therefore daily fall from his filled void into the absolute void, into his social and therefore actual non-existence. On the other hand, there is the production of the object of human activity as capital, in which all natural and social determinateness of the object is extinguished, in which private property has lost its natural and social quality, and therefore everything political and social illusion and is unmixed with any seemingly human relationship, in which the self-same capital remains the same in the most diverse social and natural manifestations, totally indifferent to its real content. This contradiction driven to the limit is of necessity the limit, the culmination, and downfall of the whole private property relationship.
Okay. So you see there's something liberatory that's implicit in all of these economists that he's been reading regarding the potential of private property, but which the movement of capital, if we'll call liberated capital in a moment, completely obliterates, because it creates this scission of estrangement and alienation internal to the social order itself, right? It splits off the social order, not in a Manichean way, but it splits it, and I think that this is the heart of the situation. So I think this is like a. Did you have any follow up on that, Andrew? Or
Yeah, and I guess it answered what my question, because it had to do with his understanding of labor, and what Karatani talks about his like sort of dogmatic slumber being awakened, or he awakened from his dogmatic slumber of the sort of Ricardian theory of
Yeah.
labor value, which
Yeah.
seems to have a more metaphysical connotation versus like the sort of not only just social determined aspect, but its relation to the commodity form. And I know that's probably imposing into the text, but I was, I guess, curious, what does he mean by labor, or his concept of labor right now? I know it's in relation to alienation, like labor is alienated from man.
No, I mean he still retains the concept of commodification of the worker
Right.
as such. So that's
Right.
already an embedded thing, but he has not yet developed his own break from Ricardo's labor theory of value, which is developed later in Capital.
Mhm.
So, but I guess you could say it's sort of in germinal or in utero at this point.
Right.
Conrad, please.
Yeah, I think part of the issue that makes it a bit hard to track what he's talking about when it comes to uh, private property and labor is that he's articulating a latent version of the commodity form, but without the concept of labor power, and without any kind of history being supplied with respect to where it comes from, or any kind of detailed history, you might say. Though I shouldn't underestimate the fact that the genesis of the commodification of labor power will ultimately remain a problem in Marx. Also, because even when we go to Capital, it's often been said that there's not an adequate demonstration of transition, which is why you get all these aporias, right? That you try to resolve in the work of Etienne Balibar, for example, right? You have
Right.
that. But yeah, I also think when it comes to the um, when it comes to the concept of value here, or the latent conceptualization of value, I think part of it, something we have to be attentive to, is the fact that Mazzaro stresses the fact that this is Marx's first sort of attempt to conceptualize the system as totality, you know, in a micro form, if you will, and that it necessarily would have to fail because of how expansive that becomes. But I think one thing one has to be conscious of here is the fact that the mechanism of transition is not the same as in capital. So in capital, of course, you have, you know, the replacement of variable capital by constant capital, right? That is workers by machines. And ultimately, as it's explained in the third volume, the collapse of the rate of profit because of that, which becomes kind of the axis on which that text moves. You don't have that here.
True.
Right? It doesn't make any kind of appearance. So I think when it comes to the means of, because the question here is, what is the contradiction that's going to bring about communism, right? And I think, you know, here there are a lot of course, sort of social phenomenological suggestions with respect to how that might happen. I think on an economic level, the closest thing we get, and someone could correct me if they have a different view of this, but I think the closest thing we get to a transitional contradiction is the dispossession of the proletariat, in the sense that the proletariat, by virtue of losing all their property, right, you know, thereby becomes de facto communized, right?
It's
and
kind
that
of,
communism,
I mean, it's kind of the immiseration thesis, right? Which frankly is sort of proven wrong at later points in capitalist development, when the working class, I mean, we talked about this the first couple sessions, and even invoke the notion of what happens when social welfare is introduced in the Second Reich, and like what, you know, the immiseration thesis kind of, it doesn't fall apart because capitalist crisis can always reintroduce it. So but that's a really great point. I really think that you're absolutely correct, and there's something therefore quite raw and open about the possibility of revolution as this kind of yearning, and this sort of, because Marx is happy to talk about the suffering of the worker, and we're told later in Capital that that's taboo to talk about suffering because we have a developed conception of commodity fetishism and things of that nature. But still, nonetheless, I think the question remains, like, yes, what can we say about these categories of suffering as Marxists that would be valid, right? In light of Marx's mature thought, right?
And it's historical too, of course, because the astonishing regularity with which he returns to the immiseration thesis here reflects the fact that even compared to 1867, you know, there had been less redistribution and less labor organization at this time. And this also explains why he devotes so much energy, compared to Capital, and I mean the 3 volumes, why he devotes so much energy here, I think, to the category of rent and you know, sort of the landed gentry, because those social categories were still of greater significance, you know, decades earlier than they would be decades later, right? So I think it's very important to situate this in the context of the development of European society as well.
I completely agree. Yeah, exactly, because we also have a proletariat which is still suffering with like all male suffrage. Access to education isn't there. So this idea of sensuous intellectual cultivation of a new conception of need, of a new conception of society, and Marx's romanticism about the French proletariat when they gather together, and how they have these beautiful ideas, and how he writes to Engels, they're more intelligent than the bourgeois students that we studied with, right?
Yeah.
So there is that romanticism. And I'm thinking, of course, of Marx's very famous debate with Willem Weitling, because you see all of the vulgar communists had an idea that you do not need propaganda in order to revolutionize the proletariat, because they held to a vulgar theory of immiseration, right? Literally, this was their view, like the Blanquists, yeah? The Blanquists were conspiratorial, and they said, look, when shit pops off, and people will follow us. We don't need some kind of discursive education and lecture to them. And then even furthermore, of course, you know, the main heart of the debate was, can a bourgeois from origin lead a working class party. And Marx had a famous debate with this guy, Wilhelm Weitling, who was way more popular than Marx. And basically Marx, in a sense, kind of won the debate, I guess, because obviously Marx is advocating that you can do that. So there's also this implicit question about proletarian leadership and education that I still find quite interesting, that tracks with a lot of like post-Leninist questions on anarchism and vanguard and things of this nature. But I think that you're right, because most socialists and communists absolutely saw the condition of the proletariat as a misceration. So Marx is, yeah. So very nice. Thank you so much, Connor.
Yeah, just really quickly, I just wanted to affirm what Conrad said, especially in this aspect of how it is that Marx doesn't seem to have developed like an idea of labor in relation to the commodity form. Like, so for example, like if I remember my Lukács correctly, you know, like in history class consciousness, it's because labor is incorporated into the commodity that the worker can have access to the totality, right? Major point. And it doesn't seem as though like, so in other words, like what is universality then in these texts and what we've read? And it seems to be this idea that the more that the worker works, they lose a sense of sensuousness. So it's this like common disposition then that is created through their labor. So it's like a universal state, so to speak, that they're like affirming through their activity, which is, yeah, a very different kind of idea of universal.
Yeah. It's really good. And I think you're right about that. I felt like it might be helpful for us to do this pithy 1, 2, 3 movement on 92 if we read it aloud, since we are in a study group. I mean, it's nice to have these kind of individual reflections, but I do want to keep us at the text. Would somebody be willing to read the relations of private prop on 92, starting with the relations of private property are labor, comma, capital, comma, and then just finish it?
Yeah, I'll go. You
Go
said
for
it was on 92?
92 at the end there, so we can then move on to the next section. Yeah, just read that so people can take notes on this movement, because this is the answer. Because there's 2 polls, but
Right.
three categories.
Right.
Go
You said the
ahead.
relations of private property, right?
Yeah.
So the
Go ahead.
relations of private property are labor, capital, and the relations between these two. The movement through which these constituents have to pass is first, unmediated or mediated unity of the two. Capital and labor at first still united. Then, though separated and estranged, they reciprocally develop and foster each other as positive conditions. Second, the two in opposition, mutually excluding each other. The worker knows the capitalist as his non-existence and vice versa. Each tries to rob the other of his existence. Third, opposition of each to itself. Capital stored up, labor. Capital as such, splitting into capital itself and into interest, and this latter again into interest and profit. The capitalist completely sacrificed. He falls into the working class, while the worker, but only exceptionally, becomes a capitalist. Labor as a moment of capital, its cost. Thus, the wage of labor is sacrifice of capital, splitting of labor into labor itself, and the wages of labor. The worker himself a capital, a commodity, inimical mutual opposition.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's really helpful, because he's now going to switch in the next section to the way that this movement, that political economists are unable to see the subjective dynamic of the liberated subject that they initially posit in the conception of private property to begin with. And so he takes this movement from like 93, he says that it's the subjective essence of private property as an activity for itself is a profound power in the realm of consciousness. And then he continues that it becomes, a mindless objectivity of wealth. And then it becomes, like we saw in the literature review in the very beginning of the first session we met, and second session as well, where the political economists and Ricardo and so on almost like have nothing to say about this condition of the worker. So they become cynical. And then it becomes finally this, what he calls the ruptured principle. And so this is, do you see, this is what he's setting off in a new subjective conception of man, okay, that is unable to be seen. And again, he doesn't have a sophisticated idea of fetishism. And we were talking before about obviously the logic of epistemology that's operating with Marx at this time is knowledge as sight, as what is seen, and what the political economists can see about the totality of the system and what they can't see about it. So that would be like a super quick way to summarize this section, 93 to 97, private property and labor views of mercantile system. But Tariq, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to contribute real quick with regards to developing the subjective side that the political economists can't see. It's really helpful that he uses for itself, and the footnotes, allude that this is a Hegelian term. And the options that they have are really good. Another one I think is worth considering in mind is that when we're thinking about for itself in Hegelian terms, a really quick and easy way that I think is kind of intuitive is that we're talking about in actuality. And so like if you read that, in actuality, private property is as subject and as persons labor. So like thinking about like to kind of get a sense of this kind of sensuous activity that we're trying to develop.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, that's really nice.
And if I could just super fast cut in, like in his really early writings, I think is when he is like the most I wouldn't say uncritically, but he's probably the most uncritically influenced by Hegel. And so I think when he uses actual, he means it in like the full sense of the term theoretically, not, like how we would maybe understand it as like this cup, or do you know what I mean? Not to say that he couldn't consider the cup, but do you know what I mean? So I think that's worth pulling out. So thanks. That's all.
Yeah, I think I follow. Could you slightly recapitulate your point so I'm totally clear, or we're totally clear?
Yeah, like for Hegel, for something to be actual, that is concrete, it's like, the unity of its reality and its essence, like a lack of, dissonance for itself. And so I think he's like trying to work with that, but then trying to figure out how, like that's why, when he's in the section, that third section of, the communism of transcendence, uses this word actual over and over and over, because I think, he's trying to work through like a political economy of actuality in the Hegelian sense. Does that make sense?
I think that's right. Although the naturalism that he is leaning on, that we will really see once we turn to the section on crude communism, which itself is a recapitulation of a prior section where he's talking about the worker in relationship to the human animal. And then he hints at a kind of horizon, which I use the word utopian, and people probably could have gotten mad at me for using that word, even though I felt like he was talking about for a moment last time we met, right? Which is, okay, what is non-estranged life? What is right? And so there is some kind of homage to that. And it comes back in a moment, which we will see after the conversation on crude communism. But basically, the point to sort of hit at here, I think, is that they have a theory of subjective essence that is not capable of understanding immiseration on the one hand, but it's also not capable of understanding the status of the worker in the condition of what he calls liberated capital, that final movement that we looked at. But you see, that doesn't mean that they're total idiots, because they still came up with the notion that is a sound notion to begin with. And so there is something, therefore, emancipatory about private property, because in a moment he's going to say that the first movement of Proudhon is basically communism qua the universalization of private property. And then, of course, he says something beautiful, which is very Nietzschean. Not Nietzschean. Okay, I should be very careful. What's the first problem with it? Envy. Proudhon mires or re-entrenches a form of envy because he can't think a true break from that sociality. He's trying to well, in the sense, he's not even really trying to negate it. He's you know what I mean? He doesn't really have a theory of negation in some sense. So we'll get to that in a moment, but I really love this section on crude communism. I don't know about you. I did get high on Nietzsche. Sorry, I've been fighting with these left Nietzscheans like vicious blood, and they've been sharpening their knives at me. But I mean, I'll show you the passage where I really let's just go to it now because we're very close. Unless anybody wants to mention something about the physiocrats and their limited understanding of the subjective essence of capitalism. But yeah, let's.
Well, there's that comparison.
Please.
There's that comparison between what the political economists are doing and what Luther did with the orbit of religion.
That's a good one.
That's on page 94.
Yes, let's read that. Would you mind reading it?
Yeah, sure. Where would you like me to start?
Why don't you start at just as Luther recognized religion?
Yeah. Just as Luther recognized religion, faith, as the substance of the external world, and in consequence stood opposed to Catholic paganism, just as he superseded external religiosity by making religiosity inner substance of man, just as he negated the priests outside the layman because he transplanted the priest into laymen's hearts, just so with wealth. Wealth as something outside man and independent of him, and therefore as something to be maintained and asserted only in an external fashion, is done away with. That is, this external, mindless objectivity of wealth is done away with private property being incorporated in man himself, and with man himself being recognized as its essence. But as a result, man is brought within the orbit of private property, just as in Luther, he is brought within the orbit of religion. Under the semblance of recognizing man, the political economy, whose principle is labor, is really no more than consistent implementation of the denial of man, since man himself no longer stands in external relation of the tension to the external substance of private property, but has himself become this tensed essence of private property.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. That's really well said. And you could even think of Marx as the Thomas Müntzer. If the political economists are Luther, Marx is like a Müntzer figure, you know, the radical opposition to Luther who wrote these, they had these fiery exchanges of letters. He's the guy that led the Peasants' War. So he's realizing something incomplete about the Protestant Reformation, just as Marx is realizing something incomplete about these political economists.
I was like that part at the end where he's talking about like the principle, the political economy whose principle is labor is really no more than consistent implementation of the denial of man. I thought of like the Communist Manifesto that starts off like history of man has been a history of class struggle, and it's like I guess like I in mind with the naturalist humanism you were talking about, like I see he's using the word man here as like if you were to throw capitalism off of man's shoulder, it's always like that is a deny. Is he saying that that would be denying one's status as man, as human being? Because since man himself no longer stands in an external relation of tension to the external substance of private property, but has become himself become the tensed essence of private property. So insofar as we are tensed by private property, then we are not mystics. We are not outside of the relations of man. Is like, and then does man desire this form of subjugation? I don't know.
I have a thought on that, but I want to open the floor. That's a great fucking question. I mean, we're even thinking of Althusserian anti-humanism here too. Why not? Right? Right? But let's hear from others, please, on this question. You can just jump in.
Yeah,
You don't need to.
I
Go ahead.
mean, there's a strong. I mean, I think what you're really talking about here is the processes of individuation, affected by capitalism, and this is, in a sense, the main subject of my thesis, which hopefully publish one of these days, Marxism contra subjectivity. I mean, I would think that you can make a strong argument that individuality, as we understand it, has no basis outside of the processes associated with the commodification of labor power, other than maybe in some completely peripheral and esoteric sort of way in terms of certain elites or whatever. But I mean, historically, if you look at even if you look at the evolution of language, you know, if you think of something like the subject in philosophy, you know, for the ancient Greeks, like, you know, subject was not subject as it's conceptualized by Kant. Like, it's not like a observational subject of philosophy, right? It was a kind of generic substratum, right? That they'll use to talk about, you know, like you have Thales and people like this, right? The Meletians, right? The substance is water, right? Of all the world, everything could be distilled into water somehow. But it's only, you know, in modernity that you know, sort of the essential, and you can see this mediation through Descartes and Kant, and even politically, of course, as well, with the category of individuality and the subject. But it's only within modernity that, you know, we fundamentally begin to perceive the individual, I think, therefore I am, right, as the essential constitutive principle of reality, right? So again, I think that, you know, there's really no way, I would go so far as to say there's no way to divorce, you know, social ontologically, the very basic way we tend to perceive reality today, you know, from the development of capitalism in this sense. And yeah, of course, like, you know, on some level, Marx is going to say that, you know, that is necessary, right? You know, because you have to have that, you know, experience of social individuation, you know, and a certain perverse form of self-realization, because history progresses from its bad side, as we know, right, to establish the premises necessary for the creation of communism as well.
Beautiful. Thank you. This is so exciting. I'm so excited to get to why Proudhon is like caught in Luther's layer, because we'll see in a moment, I think, exactly why most forms of socialism can't fully understand this dialectic between labor and private property adequately. And so we'll see. But Tara, please.
Yeah, I really appreciate, Conrad, that sort of background. I mean, I'm really interested in Marxism and ethics and the subject. And the other, just another piece there that stuck in my mind in terms of you know, just the idea of the individual being a product of basically capitalist forces, was when he's talking about the division of labor and the idea of having certain whatever natural talents, or but that one can think one has a vocation. I guess this also has to do with the actuality or reality. But if one does not practice that vocation, one does not have that vocation. So this kind of idealistic sense of the individual that we may be able to think, but then gets that cannot be acted on or realized, and then sort of becomes its opposite. And that doesn't count as real. That was just another area that I was thinking along with.
In interest of time, I want to move to this because I'd like to make it through this section and talk about the next one. Okay, so page 99, please go there. And I'm just going to read this out loud. The antithesis of property, propertylessness, and property, so long as it is not comprehended as the antithesis of labor and capital, still remains an antithesis of indifference, not grasped in its active connection. Its internal relation and antithesis is not yet grasped as a contradiction. So then immediately we see that the first form of crude communism, this kind of equalitarian communism, doesn't see it basically only sees the conundrum of private property and the, let's say, like the implicit emancipatory aspect of it as that which has to be universalized. So it's a kind of non-contradictory understanding of capitalism. And I would even say there is an interesting point about how the Jacobins in the sequence of the French Revolution did in fact attempt to introduce equality of the wage before Proudhon, right? So this is our first level of a kind of unrefined form of spontaneous thinking of communism. These usually took the form of different, well, actually, I apologize. They're different than Saint-Simon, because Saint-Simon had an understanding which itself was kind of a crude understanding of the industrial labor force. So that's the sort of second problematic one, but I want to stop and see what folks think about that, and also reference, by the way, the other problem with this on page 101 and 100. I just want to get to this, which I think is very, very useful. He says, quote, "In negating the personality of man in every sphere, this type of communism is really nothing but the logical expression of private property, which is this negation." And then he says on 101, "General envy constituting itself as a power is the disguise in which avarice reestablishes itself and satisfies itself only in another way. The thoughts of every piece of private property, inherent in each piece as such, are at least turned against all wealthier private property in the form of envy, and the urge to reduce to a common level, so that this envy and urge even constitute the essence of competition." So what do we make of this? What do you all make of this? This is an interesting kind of compounding of the problem of the way that bourgeoisie sort of subjugates a form of life that is always focused on the reproduction of a certain acquisitorial spirit, and there's different modes and ethics and virtues involved with that. Some, like he makes a different distinction between Malthus and Ricardo and Smith. Some of them are spendthrift, others are not, but still, nonetheless, they always have to face at the end of the day the bottoming out of this situation of avarice, which always returns. So therefore, then the question is, what is it about Proudhon's model of equalitarian communism that keeps that situation intact? And I think that the answer is that is answered at the level of the mode of production, of the continuation of this particular form of private property, because basically, but still, nonetheless, it's interesting though, because you all know what the maxim of Proudhon was, right? Does everybody remember this? Because in the Oppenheimer movie, famously, the actor misquotes Marx for Proudhon. Who remembers this?
What is it? Private property is theft?
Yeah. Yeah. That was a really funny moment in that movie, because it's such a sort of liberal notion of genius that Oppenheimer read all of Capital in German on a train ride one day. That's the story. I hate that. I hate that idea. So, oh yeah, I read all of Capital in German one afternoon. Yes, of course you did. I think Elon Musk said the same thing once about reading Marx.
And that he doesn't trust Engels because he did, Marx didn't write volume 2 and 3, so you shouldn't trust it because Engels had to finish it. Some ridiculous stuff.
I love that. I love that idea though. But so how do we want to linger on this question of envy and then Aliyah, I want to invite you because here we have the problem of how equalitarian communism treats the woman. In the approach to woman as the spoil and handmaid of communal lust is expressed the infinite degradation which man exists for himself. For the secret of this approach has its unambiguous, decisive, plain, and undisguised expression in the relation of man to woman, and in the manner in which the direct and natural procreative relationship is conceived. But I know, Leah, you had maybe some thoughts on this that you wanted to share with us, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely just wanted to highlight it because I thought it was an interesting, I don't know. I think that people forget that that was a question he was concerned with at all sometimes, or they speak about it as if Marxists had to kind of extrapolate that out later, which, the work needed to be done to develop it, but, he was concerned with it. It is interesting too, because he does use the example of, and I guess it's kind of it's we be careful about how we talk about it. But he does use the example of prostitution and as like a specific form where, like, okay, you can have a married woman who is essentially like property for her husband. Her job is to sexually satisfy him, maybe to provide for his emotional needs, maybe to, provide for his physical needs. And then, we can move to, the woman can, kind of go beyond that role into, prostitution where, maybe there's like a more, I don't know, but that ultimately, like, she's still on offer as a product for, sexual satisfaction, those same roles that she was playing before, but just, not as the property of one person, but as kind of like a universal
Right.
property.
Right. Like,
and
are we thinking here of like the status of like certain forms of like state capitalism today, or even certain forms of the welfare state? Like I want to linger with this problem. What is it about this first movement of crude communism that is problematic? I mean, I understand
because
this.
I think it still accepts the logic of capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Like, but just that, you get your piece is the important thing. And I think, like, I mean, maybe it's kind of an oversimplification, but I think that's really the issue with it, is we're still accepting like the basic terms of, human need and satisfaction that capitalism offers us, but just, we can partake. We're not excluded anymore, as working people. And then, of course, Marx would say, well, that's no like realization, really.
I want to ask
Yeah.
a question. I think you're right. I want to ask a question about the temporality of these three sequences. How do you guys understand the temporality of these? Do you understand them as kind of imminent forms of communist and socialist agitation to capitalism that are already bound up with the capitalism that Marx is engaged with? Or because he's also almost suggesting that these movements realize something and then spill over to the next movement, right? So I want to understand this telos. And is there a telos? I think that there is.
Yeah, it's almost kind of like it has almost a kind of phenomenological framework of like, you're moving
maybe
this place and then it gets you to that next place and then
it does.
that
I think you're
next
right.
place in terms of your consciousness. which, you know, we could talk about whether or not that is an appropriate way to understand these kinds of, we could call these like false consciousnesses, maybe.
It's very Hegelian. I mean, it's extremely moments
and I think it is true that in his later work, you even can see, like especially in his later letters, you know, when he's kind of talking about like the kind of peasants and agricultural workers in Russia, you know, he's kind of questioning this sort of stages, or, you know, like I think there is content there that would, you know, imply that, you know, he himself later doubted that there was a clear movement that, you know, we could easily articulate, and that, you know, you know, there is dynamic movement, but that we can't pre-prescribe it, really, that it's so dependent on yeah, the conditions of, you know, the state, and, you know, the economic framework that exists already, and
Yes.
divisions of labor and property.
Yes, because he's really, what he's really doing is developing up to a conception of scientific socialism, right?
Right.
He's moving from like, let's say, the Baboufists to Proudhon, to the Utopians, Saint-Simon, to Owen, right? And to the kind of industrial socialists, the political socialists. And then he's moving up through basically to the development of this naturalist, humanist, scientific conception of socialism by the time of page 105.
Right.
But again, what is the sort of I guess what's the sort of, how do you guys read this? Let's please, Matilda, please.
Yeah, everybody. The sequence to me looks like that first part with Proudhon is, it says at the bottom of 99, private property is first considered only in its objective aspect. And that Proudhon, it seems like Proudhon wants to keep the division of labor, keep like a deadened form of labor, but have the whole total wealth like separated equally, and so everybody gets a cut of the pie. And so maybe that's the sense of envy, is like kind of, there's this pie and everyone wants the equal cut of it. And then perhaps with Saint-Simon, there's a sense of a more playful form of labor that wouldn't be deadening. There has to be this introduction of the subjective aspect. And he gets into that whole thing about the human senses, that the history of humanity is the history of the development of the five senses. And that there has to be this, that it's like, regardless in history, there's been this, the laborers have continued this deadening form of labor that has like degraded their senses as well. And so there has to be this personality that's developed alongside the abolition of capital or private property. There has to be this like development of the human. And I kind of hit my head against this thing. It's like, how do you appropriate correctly? But I don't know if that's necessarily the only answer. It's like, because he gets into this other term, he says that there's both appropriation and manifestation. So I think that the appropriation has to be met with some sort of commensurate enjoyment, rather than like need has to move into enjoyment. And I think the enjoyment has to do with the development of the five senses in the workers that have been estranged somehow, but still developed, and they have to return into them, something like that.
Yeah, really well said. Yeah, really well said. Because so he goes from communism as a political nature that is either democratic or despotic, as Conrad said, to the annulment of the state, yet still incomplete, is still affected by private property, and therefore still, because when he says that the first form, the problem with it is that estrangement remains, right? And that's the problem with envy in that sense. So then the question would be, what is Marx's theory of a non-envious, or sort of where does that go? Which in a weird way, and you probably will hate me for saying this, that was actually the exact basis of the debate between Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Žižek. On their whatever. I'll stop there. But then communism as the positive transcendence of private property, as human self-estrangement, and therefore as the real appropriation of the human essence by and for man. Communism, therefore, is the complete return of man to himself as a social human being, right? So that's the real movement for the abolition of all things and the pointing towards the construction of a new sensuous idea of society that is made in that movement. And then he says beautifully, this communism as fully developed naturalism equals humanism on bottom of 102. And as fully developed humanism equals naturalism, it is the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature. And then here's an example of the famous thing you'll find if you Google Marx. Communism is the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be this solution. Boy, oh boy, oh boy. We are in the thick of it, my friends. Elia.
Yeah, I love that. However overused, I think it's so great. Yeah, no, I kind of want to not to like, I'll kind of go back, but then like I'll go back to 2, but then I'll kind of bring it back to 3. I want to get people's thoughts on this. Maybe at risk of sounding like a little bit like a broken record, because I think this second stage here, what he says about it, or the second, not maybe stage, kind of communism, I guess stage if we're speaking in terms of like, yeah, the kind of phenomenological framework that we're using for. But I think people have used this to say that, you know, that for Marx, this is not a political project at all, or that, you know, or to equate democracy and despotism in a way that I don't think is true at all. But what I think he's trying to say is that, you know, this form of communism, it kind of it understands like its goal, but that it ultimately can't get there. So, you know, like Engels has this letter, and this is many, many, many years after this is written, where, you know, again, broken record, he says, you know, Marx and I repeated ad nauseum for 40 years, like the form of the dictatorship of the proletariat is the democratic republic. And there is, you know, a lot of work you can do to try to suss out what that actually means for them, as opposed to a bourgeois republic. And I think coming from our place in history, that's a complicated thing to do. But we don't. But I think the point here is that, you know, taking political power isn't the whole. We have not yet reappropriated. If we are to take political power, or even to try to achieve it, it's just a recognition that we want to reappropriate ourselves, and that comes with autonomy and, you know, bridging these divides, but that ultimately that doesn't solve the class divide. It doesn't just automatically answer the economic
that's exactly
question.
why number 3 is also like Stalinism, and then therefore when this text is rediscovered in the era of Stalinism, you can see why it becomes this spiritual, existentialist, philosophical point of inspiration for a whole century.
Right.
You can see why. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, could you imagine you're in the Marx and Engels archives in Moscow, and you are granted access to read this for the first time in like the 1930s. Because that's actually, I think, what they did with Lukács. They flew Lukács to the archives, and he got to access to all of these heretofore never published before early Marx texts. And that's actually a beautiful way to understand all of Lukács's philosophy as one of the first major philosophers to have access to the early Marx. So anyways, that's a side point.
Yeah, no, thank you though. I think it's
yes. Well, first of all, Aaron had a hand up, and then Tariq. Aaron, if you wish to jump in.
Sure. I'm going back and forth on where, but I guess we were going through the three stages and the role of envy. And it's funny that the sort of first stage is very much, and the criticism of Proudhon and that kind of like vulgar communism is very much the sort of um, right wing caricature of what socialism is or communism is, right? You were saying like Jordan Peterson, this sums up sort of Jordan Peterson's idea that it's just kind of a leveling impulse, or Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche's hatred of socialism for the same reasons. And Marx is sort of just as critical of this idea of equality, right? That freedom is really the essence of a socialist or communist project, and that equality as conceived from within capitalist society can only be equality under the tyranny of the value form, right? Equality under the tyranny of wage labor.
Yes, exactly. He even says that the bourgeois rights of man of equality in a later point here in the same section, at this point need to be, not suspended, but they're of no use to the political struggle. They're no use to the political struggle, and I think that does. But by the way, as we know from Hunt's political biography of Marx and Engels, they oscillate on that, and the question about whether the status of the rights of man is to be inducted as a relevant political epistemological idea for the proletariat changes throughout the class struggle. I think that's important to note. It's not a total rejection of it, but in this text it is. In this text, I think it is. But I think that you're right, that this question of envy is one, but the basis by which envy is generated is based on, I mean, now I want to compare Marx and Nietzsche, but I'm not going to go down that road. For them, it's caused from two different things. It's generated from two different things. But in this case, it's this kind of undialectical halfway point of the universalization of trying to make the condition of the law of competition and avarice, and let's say the bourgeois worldview, universalized for all in some sense. Maybe that's one way to put it.
Yeah,
Aaliyah,
I mean,
sorry, no, Aaron, then Aaliyah.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up and say that, like, I mean, really existing socialist regimes sort of never seem to get beyond this point, right? And I think it's important to sort of to emphasize what it is that really makes alienation untranscendable in this state, is that you're not producing for any reason, right? You're still producing in this kind of limitless way. You're accumulating for accumulation's sake, right? Or for consumption's sake. I mean, the Soviet Union was just kind of, for its entire existence, trying to catch up to the military and consumer lifestyles of the West.
Right.
And
both classes, both subject positions are still victim to the inhuman power of capital.
Yes, because of the wage form, and because you're not and because people aren't free to choose their role in the division of labor or right, and these are kind of the stages that you have to go to. And two, where you have a political structure that's kind of pushing deliberately toward abolishing any kind of coercion, but needs that coercion still to do this project. And then three, where I guess you go from socialism to communism, right?
So how would you place like the state communism of China today in these three models? Like how would we think
not
that?
even one, because one is at least private property sort of abolished and everyone treated as a worker, whereas China has capitalist class. I mean,
That's true. It's not. It doesn't even come to. Yeah, yeah. That's probably
no,
true. Yeah, that's very true. Okay.
but yeah, yeah, go.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Aliyah. Please.
Yeah, just a quick note, because I think you're right. I think there is this oscillation in the whole body of whether or not like a framework of rights, human rights or whatever, is useful. But I think even here, as we can see kind of later on in their political work, I think a more useful like framing would just be like rather than rights, just like gains. Like as a precondition to coming to fullness, not like this is good because you're entitled to it, so you should have it, but these gains are good because they can help you to come to an awareness of your real project, and then come into your fullness of being. So it says established society can produce a man in his whole richness. And I think it is about kind of all of this here, this about this kind of new sublated affirmation of humanity is about becoming fuller. Like it is very much concerned with like lack, but I think there is here and later too in their political work, when they're working on programs, they're trying to determine like what actually are the demands here that are worthwhile and what can we forego. It's if you're hungry, you're not interested in your greater projects. Like I don't know, like you can't get there. And it's not about being stupid or not having the potential at all. It's about not having the potential because of the conditions of your need.
Yes. No, that's very well said. That's very well said. Yeah, I think that ties us back to the question of the immiseration thesis and the way that proletarian action, like what does immiseration do to proletarian possibility of revolutionizing capitalism? And one of the big debates that the League of the Just, this early communist organization, had was obviously over the necessity for developing conditions of a way of life that would be elevated welfare as a temporary measure, so that a proletarian worldview could be constructed around the development of something that would go beyond. Because you can't, like, what does it mean to have a purely anarchic or insurrectionary proletariat in a state of pure deprivation? Like, I don't know what that looks like. But Tariq, please.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just wanted to be the like annoying Hegelian person, but like I mean, I think the thing about number 3 that I think the translation is a little weird with is that I think they translate they use transcendence for translating Aufhebung. And they did this earlier in the beginning parts of this part of this chapter. And that makes sense for the first part, like you're transcending private property, you're transcending human self-estrangement, and transcending the appropriation of the human being. But if we want to really make sense of this last point that we've been thinking about, that like man returns to himself, this kind of humanist point, then we really have to stick, I think, with the Hegelian terminology of sublation, that like what we have is something that cancels out, and in that cancellation preserve something, and that preservation is what man was all along, and that is social being.
Yes. Yes, the entire movement of history is therefore both its actual act of genesis, the birth of its empirical existence, and also for its thinking consciousness, the comprehended and known process of its coming to be. Whereas that other, still immature communism, I'm on 103, meanwhile seeks a historical proof for itself, a proof in the realm of the existent among disconnected historical phenomena, opposed to private property. And here we're kind of getting an early homage to what Marx and Engels will call the true socialists. And the error that they make is that they conceive of communism purely as an idea, purely as a transcendence, tied within a conception of an idea alone, not as sensuous naturalism. But then the question for me is this: when Marx talks about sensuous naturalism, he's talking about the development of socialist organizations. That's honestly what I read it as. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. Where he says on page, where can I find it? Well, it's coming up later, but this is where he mentions the activity of actual communist organization occurring within associations. Of course, then he says also, and this is a kind of interesting rebuke to Kant, because remember, there is a thing called Kantian Marxists, and their conception of communism was formed in the era of capitalism known as mercantilism. And at that time, Kojin Karatani talks about this a lot. It was kind of like a communal-based form of almost primitive communism, where like the Kantian notion of categorical imperative and so on could be instantiated in a community and then replicated across the totality of the society. And I think that Karatani wants to make a strong claim that like number 3 and this sensuous object that must be developed is compatible with Kant's notion of associationism, okay, as that which is then I don't know, envelops the entire society. So that's something for a side point to think about. I said that also for Andrew, because I know Andrew is a huge admirer of Kojin Karatani. That might be of interest. We should talk about atheism. This is very significant. On page 104. So communism begins from the outset with atheism, but atheism is at first far from being communism. Indeed, it is still mostly an abstraction. And so for Marx at this time, just as a little side point, I want to say about atheism. Marx basically finds that atheism is meaningless because it consists in denying the existence of God and establishing man's being on that denial. Socialism no longer needs this same negation, because socialism, this is later, sorry, this is in this text, but it comes later. I don't have the page number on me right now. It takes as its starting point, I'm actually quoting Kolakowski's Main Currents of Marxism, because he has a section in there just as a side reference point for your reading. You see, because you see how this is very important. Kolakowski's Main Currents builds off of the insights of the 1844 manuscripts. And remember, this is one of the most read texts on Marxism in the 20th century, Kolakowski's. And he spends literally like hundreds of pages developing a kind of immanent theory of Marx vis-a-vis religion. And it's a kind of genealogy that he develops from Neoplatonism all the way up to the 1844 manuscripts, okay? And if you read Kolakowski's account of this, I think you'll be like blown away. And I would actually say as like something to read as a supplement to what we're reading. Check it out. So I'll continue. So atheism takes as its starting point the theoretical and practical sensual awareness of man and nature as an essence. It is the positive self-consciousness of man which no longer stands in need of the abolition of religion, just as real life is the positive reality of man which no longer stands in need of the abolition of private property, that is to say, communism. So in that sense, like what I'm trying to say here is that there's something inadequate about the form of atheism of most socialists at the number 2 stage, like the political socialists. This is what I'm getting from page 104. And I wonder if others caught that or wanted to comment on this. The philanthropy of atheism is therefore at first only philosophical, it's abstract philanthropy, and that of communism is at once real and directly bent on action. So I guess that's the point, which is fine, communism is atheism, but in your version, it's rendered as just a kind of intellectual idea. So I find this interesting because it represents a kernel of something emancipatory within religion, perhaps we could say, that is still worth preserving, perhaps. Maybe that's going too far. Aaliyah, your thoughts?
No, I think so. I think, and maybe I'm wrong. I'd like to hear others' thoughts. But what I really see here is this kind of critique of atheism as being like a denial of spiritual being for man as being something important or worth considering, or even a concept that is worthwhile to maintain, or that is a part of man. Rather though that I think, and too, it's in the death of God and that being the foundation of man's coming to be. I think all of that. Sorry, I'm distracted by the chat. But I think for Marx, the problem is religion as spirituality, kind of becoming concrete in this this other that's alien, it's totally abstracted away from us as people. And what I think that if we can find, and that in coming into species being and becoming, realizing and then becoming totally and universally men for other men as a part of a group and a community, that is where really we will find our spirituality.
Yes.
And
that's why he says on the bottom of 113, this is the quote I wanted to say: socialism is man's positive self-consciousness, no longer mediated through the annulment of religion, just as real life is man's positive reality, no longer mediated through the annulment of private property. Through communism is the position as the negation of the negation, and is hence the actual phase necessary for the next stage of historical development in the process of human emancipation and recovery. And that's actually a beautiful point, which is communism as abolition of existing situation is not, in this at 114, is not, and this is so like immense. It's not an achieved panacea per se. It's not like some utopian state, as he says it here. So there's so much to be said, though, about this point on atheism. Let's go to Kaveh.
Yeah, I want actually to connect that point to on page 103 when he says about the religion and religious estrangement as such occurs only in the realm of consciousness. And I think that's a point, like atheism, this negation of here of the religion also, I think it remains in the realm of consciousness, and that's why it tends to be idealistic, I think. And I think that's perhaps why on page 104, very much you see the association of communism with action and as a practice, right? As a way of being and exercising and as a community. I think that's perhaps one part that, I pull up, that's perhaps atheism remained one-sided because of this disconnection.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think you said it perfectly when you used idealist. It's exactly correct. Andrew. Connor, sorry. Andrew might come back. Please.
Yeah, sure. So
Oh, I didn't realize I was muted. Sorry.
Sorry, Andrew, then Connor. Go.
All I was gonna say, I was just saying that Kaveh said it beautifully, but like not only is like atheism that Marx is critiquing like very idealistic, but it's like they don't understand the form of religion. They pretty much like are negating the content, and they pretty much let God out the front door to let him back into the back door with a theology that we could see as these presuppositions of political economy or science, but mainly political economy that Marx is criticizing. And I'm a Lacanian more than I am Marxist. I am a Marxist, but I'm more versed in Lacan. So it'd be like what he says, Freud's theory of atheism is that God is unconscious, or formula for atheism is God is unconscious. And so rather than it being like something within the depths or like, basement of drives and kernel of instincts, rather it's like, for these atheists, they don't realize that they're still speaking theology because they can't identify with what they're immersed in. And that would be not just like the sort of materialist atheists, but these political economists of private property as their theology, because they can't see it. And I think you pointed it out in our first session, this like metaphysics or critique of sight, because what Marx is getting at in his critique of political economy is something that goes beyond just presence.
Well, right. And this is really nice. And it's also connected to my little tangential point on Kolakowski's point, because on 113, Marx is talking about how idealist atheism understands the origin of the origin of human existence, basically as coming from nothing. But then he says, but for socialists, man is understood in the entire so-called history of the world is nothing but the beginning of man through human labor, nothing but the coming to be of nature for man. He has the visible, irrefutable proof of his birth through himself of his process of coming to be. So you see, he's talking about creation and the pinpointing, or the kind of how the sublation, the transcendence of this third movement that we've been talking about will give birth to a real existence of man and nature. And again, Kolakowski stops at that point and he says, stop for a second. In the history of human thought, this idea of is used in Neoplatonism as the restoration of the missing kind of contingency of man. Okay. And he identifies it with Plotinus. And he says Marx can be understood as emanating in 1844 right here from that point, and that this is what actually links Marx to a theological, philosophical genealogy. Okay. That doesn't mean that Marx is a theologian. It just means that he's identified the theological tendency of political economy, and he's making a kind of imminent rupture on it. So I don't know. Yeah, Connor.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, it seems to me that Marx doesn't like atheism because, or this kind of like communist, affectionate, this atheism that like tends towards communism, because it seems like it's just emerging from like goodwill, and it doesn't appear to be rooted in an understanding of the worker's everyday life, right? to use like a jargony word, like it seems to me like you can read a lot of this as a being about affect theory, right? Like in a word, what does working do to you as a worker, right? Like literally, like how does it affect like your body and your mind? And with all of that being said, I think the major hinge point of this is how does that change how it is that we identify need, right? We live in a society that does not orient around human need. That's the problem. And yeah, so going along what is not human need, well, religion, right? The more that you sacrifice for this God, the more like fervent you believe, right? But so too, of course, for capitalism, the more that you work.
That actually now makes sense why Marx was saying that whole theory of like what you put in, you lose, and all of that. And even later in that beautiful point he makes about what it means to enjoy yourself in capitalism, that really famous quote about saving money and being spendthrift, about how it still hollows you out at the end of the day. So there's no escaping that condition in some sense. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
But I'm sorry, of course, that's a banger of a quote. I was gonna maybe mention.
I love that quote.
Maybe we can, but just really quickly.
Please.
Yeah, because I wanted to tie this up in so how is it that we can orient human need to something that affirms human needs, right? Like this is a really quick point. This is on 124 at the bottom of that first paragraph. I don't know, I just really like this. Company associate, well, I'm sorry. You see French socialist workers together. Such things as smoking, drinking, eating, etc., are no longer means of contact or means that bring together. Company, association, and conversation, which again has society as its end, human need as its end, are enough for them. The brotherhood of man is not no mere phase, or rather no mere phrase with them, but a fact of life. And the nobility of man shines upon us from their work-hardened bodies. I mean, goddamn, right? Come on. But yeah,
that's what I referenced a little. It's a little romanticism, but it's still pretty good. It's still pretty good. But obviously there's an implicit notion because he's talking about the idea. Like he's saying those socialists, the true socialists that just think that socialism is all an idea, they're missing this sensuous construction of, to use a very cliched term, of community. I hate that term, but that's what he's talking about. That's beautiful. I mean, please, Aaron.
Yeah, I think actually community is really the key thing here. I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's hard to read this from a kind of contemporary liberal understanding of what religion is, right? As a kind of belief system, as a set of, right? I guess like in Germany, this compromise hadn't been reached yet in the 1840s. I think it's only in like the 1870s after unification when the idea of like you have your nationality, which is German, and you have your confession, which can be Protestant or Catholic or Jewish or right. And this idea, when Marx is writing and sort of going back to Hegel, that religion is still this kind of thing not separable from political power, not separable from the state, and that it is kind of the implicit set of norms and principles that guide a community. Right. And their atheism is also supposed to be this under communism, and thinking of it just as kind of an individual who gets rid of their belief in God simply misses the point, right?
Yeah, exactly, because he says there's a form of inactive, extravagant wealth given over wholly to a pleasure, the enjoyer of which on the one hand behaves as a mere ephemeral individual frantically spending himself to no purpose, knows the slave labor of others, human sweat and blood, as the prey of his cupidity, and therefore knows man himself, and hence also his own self as a sacrificed and empty being, right? So he's later then talking on 125 of this form of how the worker kind of has to realize also their own alienation, I think, is part of this. So this brotherhood, this community also is not purely a positive like this. So there's a kind of there must be the realization of this brotherhood of workers, of the problem of their immiseration and the problem of their own self-estrangement. So I think the question then is, what is the political education that is requisite for that consciousness to emerge amongst the working class? And I think that that is still very much a question that is on the docket for today. Kaveh, would you like to jump in, please?
Yeah, I'm just quick note. I mean, something really strikes me about this text. I mean, that at least from my reading, which tend to see the aesthetic side of the text. I mean, in one sense, it's about, of course, it's about the immiseration of the workers, about the material condition and so forth, but it's also about the culture and the aesthetic of existing, and the idea of how capitalism ruined this. Capitalism ruined this as a way of existence. In more aesthetic sense. I think that's when you're talking about this idea of the community. To me, this is all this idea about there can be a better culture and better way of sensual existence, which completely deprived of, because the whole system, which also included everyone, not just only the workers. And it's amazing. I mean, I think that's part of the text very much striking
Yeah,
me.
I mean, you can see why Marx is laying out the vocation of the sociologist in a disciplinary way, or why it would be, because on page 128, it becomes the construction of the sensuous object of the workers in brotherhood, etc., is around the development of society, around a new conception of society. And this obviously links us exactly to Lukács's interpretation of the Communist Manifesto as having everything to do, because the question is, what is the meaning of Marx's rebuke to stages 1 and 2, especially to the true socialists? Well, it is that the true socialists do not link up with the standpoint of this form of the construction of the sensuous object, i.e. the standpoint of the proletariat. That's the standpoint of the proletariat, is the ensemble of different actors that construct a new conception of society. Maybe that's, I don't know what you all think about that. Aaliyah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try to make this quick because this is kind of like a big tangent, and I know we're running out of time here, so I'm going to try to condense this idea here. But earlier on, I'm not remembering the page exactly, but earlier on in this section, or maybe it was even the last section, I don't remember, but Marx talks about how, we couldn't really construct psychology as a science. And the idea is kind of, if we are in our inner life, we are alienated from ourselves. How can we construct a true science? And, and that's kind of the Hegelian true versus correct, right?
Right.
And so, but here's the kicker, is then on 125, it's so fascinating because Marxists, for the most part, they either love him or they hate him, but a lot of Marxists hate Lacan. And I wouldn't call Lacan a Marxist. However, if you take kind of the basic ground of a lot of his theories, it is almost, you could almost say it's ripped right from the page of 125. Too, because if you take like the Freudian death drive, like Hegel talks about how the true is it's in harmony with essence. So you could call the death drive like the thing that gets away from trueness, our desire that is antithetical to our life. That is like the intrusion of the untrue in our consciousness. And then here on 125, Marx says, Estrangement is manifested not only in the fact that my means of life belongs to someone else, but that my desire is the inaccessible possession of another, but
Right.
also in the fact that everything is in itself something different from itself, that my activity is something else, and that finally, and this applies also to the capitalist, all is under the sway of inhuman power, the untrue. Like, that's like, Marxists need to, like, I want them to make this connection so
Yeah.
bad, and I think a lot of them struggle, but I'd like to hear what other people think of it. We're being very syncretic here,
Well,
but
I'll just say that what does Lacan say in Seminar 16 about surplus value, line with surplus jouissance, that Marx invented the symptom. And I forget who said it. I think it was Connor, something about the Marx and the drives. Zizek says also that Marx not only invented the symptom, but the drive. And you could see like MCM and CMC as like the logic, because drive is logic. It's a myth of logic.
Mm.
Like, I just want to say, because like I don't want to get too jargony or too away from Marx, right? Like, what's going on is this historicizing of the senses. Like, that's, you can
Yes,
see
we
that
didn't
in
talk about that. Yeah.
But I think that's really important because it has this explanatory power of how it is that we identify need,
Yeah.
right? There's a historical explanation for why we see our needs when we act upon them actually go against human needs, right? So
Yeah, let's go back and let's start next time on this naturalism and the senses, and let's start with that, because we missed a few things as we danced through this text, but I thought this session was really good. Thank you guys so much. We're way over time, so I guess we can close unless there's any burning thoughts that must be stated. Please, and I welcome that. Yeah, I had a great time as well.
What pages would you like us to prepare for next time?
Well, let's try to finish, if that's reasonable. We'll see how that goes. If not, it's all good. I mean, so that would be, I mean, it's listed on the Patreon, but I'll tell you right now, it's going to be to 168.
Okay.
So if we're at 125, so 125 to 168.
All the desire folks are gonna love the section on money.
It gets even more Lacanian.
Yeah.
I cannot wait. I'm so excited.
Oh my
We're
God.
really
I
getting
know
into the good stuff here, guys.
we got Nietzschean Marxist, we got Lacanian. Now it's like, oh my God. No, but this has been exhilarating. I just want to thank you guys for such a fun and enriching experience. I hope that this benefits all of your research and everything you're doing.
Thank you so much for hosting this. This is excellent.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, this was
Okay.
a fire
Yeah,
session.
thank you.
Beautiful. We'll see you in 1 week. All the best. Take care.
Later,
Thanks.
everybody.
Bye-bye.